Edward's rage knew no bounds. This time he was determined to let those betraying him feel the full force of his wrath. 18 years of marriage had meant nothing to his unfaithful wife, so why should they matter to him? Welcome, dear viewer. The husband had long suspected infidelity, but now he had all the proof. Let's discover how this tale of betrayal concludes. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let's dive in. From the moment I first set foot in my new school, I felt like my life was about to take a dramatic turn. Having spent my whole life in the same town, even moving just an hour away felt like stepping into an entirely new world. I realized that I'd have to adjust, though adapting had never come easily to me. My father warned me to stay out of trouble, and my mother insisted I follow his advice exactly. The city I moved to was a melting pot of cultures, filled with people from various backgrounds and races. Despite the diversity, fitting in wasn't difficult, but I couldn't shake the feeling of missing my old friends. After graduating, I decided to remain in the area, mostly because my family was nearby. Although I stayed, I frequently visited my old neighborhood to reconnect with childhood friends. My first job was delivering fuel to local homes. I drove a truck around the city, but after a few years I transitioned into an office role, handling orders and customer service. To my surprise, I excelled in the position and could easily see myself running a similar business someday. Socially, I had no issues either. I made friends easily, especially with women, and my life was more active than I had anticipated. When I married, my mother had her reservations. Angela, my wife, was Italian, but my mother tried to accept her. After our second child was born, Angela began insisting that I get a vasectomy. I didn't oppose the idea, but once the kids started school, Angela expressed a desire to return to work. My father had always been against women working outside the home, though I never really understood his reasoning. In hindsight, I started to see his perspective. It wasn't Angela working that bothered me, it was the people she reconnected with through her job-old acquaintances from her past. Some I could tolerate, but others rubbed me the wrong way. Angela loved being involved in school activities, constantly signing up for clubs and events, but I distanced myself from that scene, finding the people there smug and self-absorbed. We both had histories before we met, but we had an unspoken agreement to leave them behind. Yet, after 18 years of marriage, everything began to unravel. Angela worked in the claims department of a major insurance company, and I couldn't ignore the increasing late nights and weekend shifts. 4 months went by, and when she mentioned an upcoming seminar, I couldn't pretend anymore. "Edward, I don't understand why this is such an issue," Angela said, trying to sound reasonable. "It's only 4 days. I've already arranged for your mother to watch the kids while I'm gone, and you'll be home in the evening," she added, as if that solved everything. "You'll manage." I couldn't believe she had the nerve to suggest this. "Who's going to this seminar?" I asked, watching her closely. Her face lit up as she began naming colleagues, 6 people from her department, Betty from HR, and then Brian. I forced a smile, but inside I was seething. How could she not realize that I had known all along? For months, I had been aware of her secret lunches and late meetings with her boss, Brian Moore, a man she had known since high school, part of the same crowd. Angela had always gravitated toward people who thrived on clubs and events, anything but sports. "Do you think I'm an idiot?" Angela, my voice cut through her attempts to seem innocent. "What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning ignorance. "I've known about you and Brian for a while now," I said coldly. "If you think I'm going to let you go away with him for 4 days, you're out of your mind?" "Edward, you're being ridiculous," she snapped, her frustration evident. "Brian is my boss, and there's nothing between us. I would never cheat on you, and you know that." I glanced down at the empty beer can in my hand, then stood and walked to the kitchen. Crushing the can, I tossed it toward the trash, missing, but I didn't care. Grabbing a fresh can, I opened it, the sound of gas escaping filling the room as I sat back down. Angela remained seated, watching me, bracing herself for what I would say next. "You're a great mother to our kids, Angela. I'll give you that," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That's the only reason I haven't kicked you out yet. I talked to my mom, and she told me to hold on, to give you a chance for the kids' sake. If I ever decide to leave, I know the court will grant you custody, and that's something I can't allow." "So, did you tell your mother that I'm cheating on you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Not exactly," I replied. "It wasn't me. A woman from church mentioned something, and when my mom asked me about it, I didn't deny it." "This can't be happening," Angela muttered, her voice breaking. "I can't believe you're saying this. What's going on?" I took a long sip of my beer and smirked. "You know where Brian lives, don't you? 2 blocks from your office. You've been to his place several times a week, on average 3 times. You spend hours there. What exactly are you doing? And while we're at it, I care to explain all the overtime. Did you know the cleaning lady at your office goes to my mother's church?" Angela's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling. "As long as you don't embarrass me or our family publicly, I won't take action," I said coldly. "But if you do, consider this your warning. You can stay or leave, but I will make sure you never take my sons from me." Suddenly, Angela stood, trembling all over. "Damn you, Edward! I hate you. You're a disgusting man with that." She stormed out of the room, sobbing uncontrollably. It was the first time she had ever cursed at me. Her true nature had finally surfaced. We had 2 sons, Donald and Christopher, who shared a bunk bed in the same room. The 3rd bedroom, once meant for something else, had turned into storage, and it had become where I slept since that night. Our home was a rental, and we had saved over $100,000 to buy our dream house, but what was once my dream had now become a nightmare. The seminar Angela had mentioned never came up again. She stopped working late and started bringing lunch from home, but the atmosphere between us wasn't just cold, it was frozen. My mother no longer brought any gossip from church, and things seemed to have settled down. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. There was no love left between us, and I knew I wasn't going to endure this much longer. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go to Angela's company Christmas party. I didn't want her to attend by herself and figured I could survive the evening by staying in the background. What I thought would be a manageable evening turned out to be a huge mistake. The company had rented out a hall with a dance floor, buffet, and open bars. I figured I could get through the night by nursing a couple of beers. When we arrived, the only seats available were near the management tables. The first hour went smoothly. I spotted Brian on the opposite side of the room, chatting with some friends. A few of Angela's co-workers asked her to dance, but Brian kept his distance. I wasn't bothered by her dancing with others. Dancing wasn't my thing. I was halfway through my 3rd beer when I noticed something strange. Angela and Brian were exchanging glances. It wasn't blatant, but there were subtle nods and head tilts. Something was definitely up. I acted like I didn't care, but kept watching closely. Then Angela said she needed to use the restroom. Looking around, I noticed Brian had disappeared too. I couldn't believe it. After all the talks we'd had at home, she had the nerve to try and meet him here, right in front of me. She could meet him at work without the risk of being caught, so why now? The only reason I could think of was to humiliate me in front of everyone. Brian's friends, who were gathered at the bar with smug expressions, only confirmed my suspicions. When Angela walked down the hall, she glanced over her shoulder to make sure I hadn't moved, then vanished from sight. I calmly headed toward the main table, pretending I was on my way to the bathroom. I leaned over to apologize to the hosts, drawing attention while Brian's smirking friends started to look uneasy, unsure how to help him now. I decided to check the women's restroom first, hoping someone might be inside, but it was completely empty. Everything changed in the men's room, though. That's where I found them, bodies entwined, her back against the wall, his hand sliding under her skirt. She wasn't resisting. My hands wrapped around Brian's neck, and with a swift movement I slammed his head into the cold bathroom wall. I heard a sharp crack. Angela screamed my name over and over, but I wasn't listening. I spun Brian around and blood from his broken nose splattered on my shirt. Even though he was dazed, he remained standing, so I punched him in the stomach. Angela clung to my jacket, trying desperately to pull me away, but her efforts were useless. When I left the bathroom, the hallway fell silent. I dragged Brian by his tie, ignoring his gasps for air as I pulled him across the floor. The band had stopped playing, and everyone in the hall was staring. I let go of Brian, dropping him to the floor, and scanned the crowd, daring someone to intervene. No one did. "Sorry for ruining your wonderful party," I said with a sneer. "I'm leaving now, but feel free to enjoy my wife's company. Just be sure to send her home when you're done." Brian struggled to get to his hands and knees, blood covering his face. Angela stood frozen in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Whether she was more shocked by the beating or by what I had said to her colleagues, I couldn't tell, and it didn't matter. Before leaving, I glanced up at the mistletoe hanging over Brian's head and couldn't resist. I kicked him hard between the legs, ensuring the pain would last. He collapsed face first onto the floor. It must have hurt. The silence was deafening. No one dared to say a word. I got into the car and immediately called my mother. I asked her to come pick up the boys. I couldn't leave them with their mother. She wasn't fit to care for them. As I drove off, plans started to form in my head, although I wasn't sure where I'd end up. My boss didn't mind when I requested a week off. When I got home, my parents were already there. I paid the babysitter and helped pack up the kids. I threw a few clothes, socks, underwear, and essentials into a bag. Before leaving, I grabbed the box of cash I had hidden in the basement rafters. With interest rates so low, I figured it was safer to keep my savings close. Maybe it was reckless to stash $100,000 in the house, but I'd picked up the habit from my mother, who always hid money around the house. As I turned off the lights, the taxi pulled up, and Angela stepped out. She entered the house without a word, sitting on the couch, looking more worried than angry. I had only one rule, I said, leaning against the doorframe. Don't embarrass me and our family in public. But you couldn't help yourself, could you? She began to cry, but I wasn't interested in watching her tears. I left around 10, heading straight for the highway. What a night. At least the party was over for me. I needed to visit an old friend, Nancy. She owned a small cafe in the neighborhood where we grew up. It wasn't trendy, more like a local diner that tourists didn't know about. Nancy made most of her money through not entirely legal means, which we either ignored or quietly supported. She lived upstairs and conducted her real business in the back room. Walking into her cafe felt like stepping back in time. After I explained my situation, she agreed to assist. "Edward, this is going to cost you $110,000, Nancy said, her tone serious as she looked me directly in the eyes. Do you have that much, or do you need a loan?" "I have it," I responded calmly. "How do you want to handle this?" Her voice shifted to a more businesslike tone, rough and quick or smooth and clean. "Let's keep it clean," I replied. The arrangement was made without unnecessary details. The plan was straightforward. I needed to disappear for a few days, but nothing had been officially planned yet. "Got anything in mind?" Nancy asked. "Not really," I said. "I thought about maybe going to Las Vegas." 6 days, 7 nights, Nancy suggested. I raised an eyebrow, confused. "What do you mean?" "I have free tickets. It's exactly what you need," she explained. It sounded enticing, so I agreed. "Sure, that works for me." "Are you going alone, Edward?" she asked persistently. "Yeah, it's all kind of last minute," I admitted, explaining I hadn't had time to invite anyone. Nancy wasn't convinced. "You need someone to confirm you were actually there," she insisted before picking up the phone and dialing a number she clearly knew by heart. "Barbara, it's Nancy. Pack your things and come over," she said, pausing before adding with a smirk, No, it's not like that. You're going on a trip." As she hung up, she turned to me and said, "Remember Barbara, Edward, William's eldest daughter?" Yes, I remember. I nodded, recalling the chubby girl with deep brown eyes who was always giggling. "How old is she now?" I asked as Nancy smiled at the memory. "She's 27 now, Edward, and she's definitely not chubby anymore," Nancy replied with a grin. Suddenly it hit me Barbara would be my travel companion. It felt a bit odd, given that she was Nancy's niece, but this whole plan was Nancy's idea. "Edward, do you have a credit card?" Nancy asked. "I've got 2, I replied. I was planning to cancel them next week." "Don't," Nancy warned. "You'll need them. Use them for food, room service, maybe even pull out some cash at the casino, but don't go overboard. You need to leave a trail of your stay, spread the expenses out so it doesn't look like you left early. It'll cost a couple $1,000, but that's a small price for peace of mind." Nancy had thought everything through, and it all made sense. I was still processing the details when Barbara walked in. "Edward, I haven't seen you in ages." "You look great," she greeted me warmly. Now I understood why Nancy was so pleased earlier. Barbara had grown into a beautiful young woman, but her dark eyes were captivating, and her former baby fat had given way to curves in all the right places. I stood up awkwardly, knocking over a chair in the process. "Edward could use some company for a few days," Nancy remarked. Barbara's expression shifted. "You're still married, right?" she asked, turning to me. Before I could answer, Nancy interjected. "His marriage is over, Barbara. What Edward needs now is a friend, not a wife. I remember how fond you were of him growing up, so I thought you'd be the perfect choice." "I'm not going to break up someone's family," Nancy Barbara replied firmly. "It's not fair to put me in that position. Besides, I'm not one of your girls. Why not send one of them?" "I'm not asking you to sleep with him," Nancy assured her. "Just support him, help him relax, clear his head." Barbara glanced between us, clearly weighing the offer. A slight smile appeared on her face. "All right, Edward," she said softly. "I'll go with you, but you owe me a box of chocolates." The tension in the room eased, and we all smiled, lightening the mood a bit. "Give me an hour to get ready," Barbara said, turning to Nancy. "Please keep an eye on him, no drinks. I don't want to drive with him drunk," she added, casting a playful glance at me. There was something sly in her eyes, as if she was sending me a secret message before she left to pack. While Barbara was getting ready, Nancy and I went over everything we had discussed earlier. The person we hired was confident they would deliver the desired results. The trip went smoothly, although I knew I would soon need to explain everything to Barbara about the situation with Angela. When I finally told her, she responded with quiet sympathy. Poor kids. Upon arriving at the hotel, Barbara noticed the 2 beds and frowned slightly, though she didn't see the grin I tried to hide. I had no doubt that by the end of the week, one of those beds would remain untouched. Patience always pays off. We played some light-hearted games and attended several shows. The first night I kept my distance, but by the middle of the second day, our relationship had shifted beyond casual interaction. My mother always said I should marry someone from our background, and at that moment everything felt right, as if I wasn't betraying anyone. On the 4th evening, just as we were getting ready for dinner, there was a knock at the door. 2 men stood there, not in formal attire but wearing casual sports jackets. Edward Rodriguez, right one of them, asked. "I'm Stephen Jackson, and this is Daniel Miller. We're with the Special Task Force for Crime Investigation. Do you mind if we have a word?" Barbara, who had just stepped out of the bathroom in her underwear, froze for a moment before quickly throwing on a robe. She looked startled but not entirely surprised. We had anticipated that this might happen. "What's this about?" she asked. "We need to discuss your connection with Brian Moore," Jackson said. "I have no connection to Brian Moore, my wife does," I replied calmly. Despite my composure, I could sense the tension in both men. Jackson continued speaking while Miller couldn't seem to take his eyes off Barbara. "We know that, Mr. Rodriguez. But we also know you spoke with him last Friday at the company's Christmas party. Can you explain why?" Jackson asked. "Did he file a complaint?" I asked, thinking it might be something minor. "No," Jackson answered. "He's gone missing, and we were hoping you could help us figure out where he might be." I paused, then said firmly, "If we're going to continue this conversation, I want a detective from the Las Vegas Police Department present someone from their detective unit. If that's not possible, I'll call my lawyer." The agents didn't say a word. "Barbara, get dressed, we're going to dinner." "Sorry, gentlemen, but we have a reservation for 7, I said calmly. "I'm planning to head home on Friday, so if you'd like to continue this conversation, we can arrange it then." The agents seemed surprised by my nonchalant response. "Why assume anything is wrong?" "Maybe he just decided to take some time off," I suggested. Jackson replied. "He was last seen getting into a cab outside the local hospital early Sunday morning, and no one has heard from him since." By then Barbara was dressed, and I was buttoning my jacket. "Well, I've been here since Friday, and the hotel staff can confirm that. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have dinner plans. Everything else will have to wait until Friday." Jackson nodded. "Yes, we have more questions, but they can wait." I escorted the agents to the door, and we all rode down to the lobby in silence. Once we parted ways, Barbara and I continued with our evening, leaving the agents to talk to hotel security. When I finally returned home, Donald and Christopher were eager to talk. Angela, however, seemed distant, as if she wasn't sure of her place or what was expected of her. After my conversation with the police, I spent the rest of the day with the boys, knowing I would have to talk to Angela later that evening. As the evening wore on, the boys settled in front of the TV, and I waited at the kitchen table for Angela to finish what she was doing. She didn't hurry, but I remained seated. Eventually, Angela came over, sat down, and leaned her elbows on the old table. "What did you do to Brian?" she asked. Her voice wasn't harsh or accusatory, just genuinely curious. She met my eyes for a brief moment before looking away, as if she was bracing herself for my response. "I spent a week in Las Vegas. I haven't seen Brian since the party," I said. "You heard what happened, didn't you?" She nodded slightly. "He spent 2 days in the hospital. You broke his jaw and nose," she stated plainly, not accusing me, just laying out the facts. "He deserved it," I replied. She didn't ask any more questions, so I continued. "Why were you in the men's room with him?" She remained silent, offering no explanation. "Why was his hand under your skirt?" I pressed, my voice growing tense. "Still," she said nothing, nervously fidgeting with her hands and staring at the table. "Why aren't you at work? And why are the boys home instead of at school?" I asked sharply. She sighed deeply. "I had to quit. I couldn't go back after what happened. I kept the boys home because your mother said you might return today." I decided to cut to the chase. "I gave you one rule, just one. You weren't supposed to embarrass me or our family in public. It wasn't that hard. So why did you choose to break it?" Angela's anxiety visibly increased as I spoke. "You and Brian, you couldn't resist throwing it in my face, could you? Why?" She remained quiet, but as I slammed my fist on the table, she finally responded, her voice trembling. "I don't know why it happened. We thought you didn't care. You were so distant, lost in your own world. We thought we could hide it. We didn't think you'd react like this. You scared me." For the first time, she showed some emotion, but her words felt hollow. They made no sense. If they had wanted to hide their affair, there were plenty of other ways to do it without humiliating me. No matter how much she tried to explain, that fact wouldn't change. "Angela, you have 3 options," I said coldly. "You can stay here and be a mother to our boys. You can leave and file for divorce, but the boys stay with me. Or you can disappear entirely." I paused to let my words sink in. "But if you stay, it's over between us. We are no longer husband and wife, and I won't tolerate any more affairs, especially not with Brian." At the mention of Brian's name, she burst into tears, unable to hold them back. Before I could say anything else, she ran out of the room, her sobs echoing down the hallway. I figured we would have to finish the conversation tomorrow. From that point on, everything changed. I found a small apartment nearby, close enough so the boys could visit whenever they wanted. Barbara moved in with me. The police asked a few more questions, but the case was eventually closed. As for Brian Moore, he was released from the hospital, but no one had seen him since. Despite a reward from Angela's family, there were no leads. Each evening, I would sit down to dinner with Angela and the kids. On weekends, I tried to spend quality time with them. It was clear to everyone that our marriage was over, though we never formally divorced. Angela spent a lot of time with her parents and sister, and it didn't bother me. After the Christmas party, she quit her job and showed no interest in finding another one. We never revisited the conversation from that night. When I was home, Angela maintained the appearance of a dutiful mother. The house was always tidy, the boys were well fed, and their clothes were spotless. I handled the yard work and all the outdoor chores. I gave Angela $300 a week for groceries and household expenses, and if I offered more, she'd refuse. For Thanksgiving and Christmas, the boys and I would go to my family's gatherings, and Barbara often came along. Angela preferred to spend the holidays with her own family, except for Christmas Eve, which she spent with the boys. Whenever Donald or Christopher tried to bring up our situation, it was awkward, and neither Angela nor I wanted to delve into it. I appreciated Angela's silence. What could she say? For years we kept up this charade. My brief summary doesn't capture all the complexity. We constantly faced arguments and challenges, but somehow we managed to hold it together. At first, things with Barbara were smooth, but over time she began spending more time with her family and less with me. I couldn't blame her. I owed her for helping me through the collapse of my marriage. Under the circumstances, divorcing Angela wasn't feasible, and with the boys still living at home, I had to maintain some semblance of stability. I couldn't bring myself to throw her out. These were boundaries I had set and intended to follow. I despised the situation, but I couldn't envision a better way to handle it. The boys, however, eventually found a solution. Donald was 17 when everything unraveled. A new student, a relative of Angela's former lover, began taunting Donald about the affair. It was the first time he faced the reality, and he wasn't ready for it. Brian's nephew ended up in the hospital, and I had to pick Donald up from school. He was suspended for 2 weeks, and there were possible assault charges. Unfortunately, Christopher had seen the fight and tried to intervene, but despite this, Donald gained a new level of respect for his brother for stepping in. When we got home, Angela was waiting. Without any hesitation, Donald unleashed his fury, berating his mother for hiding the truth from them for all these years. Angela stood there, silent and still, as her son's anger washed over her. I left with Christopher, taking him to the dentist. He wasn't particularly upset about losing a tooth, though I wasn't thrilled about the impending dental bills. When we returned, Angela was gone. Her car remained in the driveway, but there was no other sign of her. Donald explained that she had taken her purse and left without a word. I took a week off work, hoping to restore some normalcy. Angela's parents and sister refused to speak with me, and after a week passed, I still had no idea where she had gone or what her plans were. Barbara moved in with me during that time. Sharing a bed felt strange at first, but surprisingly, the boys accepted it more easily than I had expected. One day while I was at work, all of Angela's belongings disappeared from the house. I didn't ask Barbara what she had done with them, and she didn't offer an explanation. She seamlessly took over Angela's responsibilities without any hesitation. I handed her a few credit cards to help manage things, and strangely, I trusted her more than I ever trusted Angela. I sold Angela's car and bought a new one for Barbara. Family gatherings became more peaceful in the new setup. Barbara was much livelier, and my mother couldn't have been happier. Donald and Christopher settled back into school without further problems, and Brian's nephew was no longer a part of our lives. Despite all these improvements, I remained technically married. 2 months later, I finally went to the authorities and reported Angela as missing. In truth, I wasn't really looking for her, I just needed to lay the groundwork for a divorce based on abandonment. I waited another 2 months before filing the papers. Legally, Angela had to be absent for a full year before the divorce could be finalized, but I prepared in advance to ensure a smooth transition at home. Donald and Christopher interacted with Barbara comfortably, though they never called her mom, always using her first name. It didn't bother me. In many ways, we felt more like a real family than we had in years. Then, without any warning, the final divorce papers arrived. I was officially free. 2 weeks later, Barbara and I went on a trip and got married, becoming a family once again. Donald graduated from high school and enlisted in the Air Force. A year later, Christopher started taking computer courses. Time flew by, and soon Barbara and I found ourselves alone in the house. Angela had completely vanished from our lives, and my parents had moved away, promising to visit a couple of times a year. With nothing keeping us in town, Barbara and I decided to return to our hometown. Christopher finished his studies and landed a job at a well-known firm. About a year later, Barbara's niece got married, and we were, of course, invited to the wedding. We were sitting with friends, enjoying the evening, but I noticed Barbara seemed unsettled. She kept glancing toward the dance floor as if something or someone had caught her attention. I looked several times but didn't see anything unusual. I forgot about it until Barbara excused herself to go to the bathroom. Something didn't seem right. I watched as she walked to the back of the hall and met with an old friend. They exchanged a few words and gestures, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Instead of heading to the restroom, Barbara went over to one of the bride's assistants. She gestured toward the table where her friend had been sitting earlier. At the table sat 3 men and 3 women, all overdressed, their movements slow and deliberate. Barbara returned to our table with a calm but serious look on her face. "Edward, we have a small problem," she said. "I knew something was off by the way you were acting." "Care to explain?" I asked. "Whatever happens, stay calm," she warned. "In a few minutes, one of the men from that table is going to come over and try to provoke you." "Provoke me?" how I asked, confused. "He's going to insult me, say things to rile you up. When you stand up to confront him, the others will jump in," she explained. "And I'm just supposed to let this happen?" I asked, bewildered. "Not exactly. Just play along until Charles and the others are in position. You might have to handle one of them, but that's as far as it'll go," she reassured me. "Play along?" how I asked, still unsure. "If he calls me something inappropriate, ask him how much he's offering. Go along with whatever he says. The key is not to lose your cool," she explained further. "And why are these people targeting me?" I insisted. Look at the table by the bar, she said, nodding in that direction. Do you see the woman with short bleached hair? I squinted and suddenly recognized her. You've got to be kidding me. That's Angela. What's she doing here? Barbara sighed. Rumor has it her boyfriend is somehow connected to the bride. She responded, her voice tinged with annoyance. Seems like Angela still harbors a grudge. When she found out you were here, she dragged him into some plot to set you up. Looks like she's aiming for revenge. I muttered under my breath, so she's out for payback. While you deal with nice people, Emily and I will take care of Angela in the ladies' room. Trust me, it's going to get ugly, Barbara added, her tone steely. A wave of unease washed over me. This was a wedding, a night meant for joy, something that should be remembered with happiness. Letting a few troublemakers ruin such an important event felt wrong. About 5 minutes later, I saw Angela's boyfriend stand up. An inner voice warned me that trouble was brewing, so I excused myself from the table and got to my feet. Barbara shot me a concerned glance, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. I calmly made my way toward the side exit, the spot where people usually went to smoke. The guy nodded to his 2 companions, signaling them to follow him. What they didn't realize was that 3 men were already sneaking up behind them, baseball bats in hand, hidden earlier behind the bar. A small group of smokers stood outside, chatting. You better leave, I said firmly. Sensing the tension, they left without a word. Once they were gone, I took a few steps from the door and stopped, waiting. The men strutted out with smug grins, but their expressions quickly changed when the door slammed shut behind them. In mere seconds, their arrogance vanished as they came face to face with the 3 men holding bats and the bride's father. Everything unfolded in less than 30 seconds. I didn't need to lift a finger. Once it was over, I turned to the bride's father. Apologies for this mess. It could have ruined your family's night, I said, feeling like a character from a mafia movie. He shook my hand, gratitude shining in his eyes. Thanks for handling it outside, he replied, before returning to rejoin his daughter. Nye's men stayed behind to clean up the scene, but I knew it was time for me to leave. As I scanned the room for Barbara, I noticed that Angela's table was empty. My son, Christopher, must have picked up on the tension, because he found me at the bar, sipping a cold beer. Dad, what's going on, he asked, raising an eyebrow. I hesitated for a second before telling him the truth. Your mother's here with her new boyfriend. That's all you need to know, I said quietly. Christopher smirked, shook his head and ordered himself a drink. We spent the next hour steering clear of any talk about the drama, sticking to lighter conversation instead. Soon enough, Barbara showed up, looking a bit drained. Where have you been, I asked. She grinned, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Emily and I took your ex to the hospital. She wasn't feeling too well. Christopher and I couldn't help but laugh at the ridiculousness of it all. Edward, can we go home now, Barbara asked, clearly tired. Despite the chaos of the evening, there was something oddly satisfying about how everything had turned out. Angela, no one's seen her since. Barbara and I are still together, living in the same neighborhood, my friend. And that's the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.